organizing organizing this program and helping with promotion. You guys have been amazing to work with. And welcome everyone. And just a quick note, I've been doing these for this group for a long time. And I remember going down to downtown Boston, early, rushing to find parking, whatever. And it's nice. This group is really nice. It's a larger group of people. It seems more accessible. I'm working with a firm that's in the Pacific Northwest who is going to watch this because it's being recorded. So I just think in general, it's awesome. I think your reach is really, growing. So I'm going to do a quick background, so yeah, that's a picture of a tornado. People that know me know I have this strange kind of hybrid background. I'm an environmental scientist and consultant, have a couple degrees in atmospheric sciences and then kind of an MBA to kind of neutralize those degrees. So I come from the industry on the engineering consulting side. That's kind of where I cut my teeth on the industry at Stone & Webster Engineering in Boston. And then I left them and I was a partner at Zweig White. And I headed up their marketing and business development, consulting, training, research, planning, all that stuff before starting my own company in 2001. So all I know is really this industry. And by the way, I am going on my 6th tornado chase at the end of April. So I can't wait. So cross your fingers, folks, that I'm going to get some good action. So yeah, this is what our company does. You can read this at your leisure, go to our website. In essence, we help firms craft and implement growth strategies. You'll see here one of the things, market research and client research, that we do quite a bit. And I'm so passionate about this topic. I've been writing and speaking about it for years and years, even before the digitized client feedback tools like Client Savvy and others. And I recognize there's a lot of different ways to do this. You can use a digitized tool. You can do phone interviews. You can train your PMs and others to know how to ask really good probing questions throughout the project. I used to have clients that actually, did all of them in person, but that became too difficult and too cost prohibitive for them. So the bottom line is I'm trying to give you some good ideas. I recognize that your style may be completely different, but one of the things I want to share is just what I think works, what has the highest return on investment. And one last point, I'm always amazed by how difficult it can be for me to educate and convince a client organization on the importance of doing this. It baffles me. A lot of firms struggle with this, and it never seems to become a priority. And when you think about firms that can spend every year or every 2 years, a day or a day and a half in an offsite, trying to think about what differentiates their firm, what value do they bring, how are we positioned, and they do this in a vacuum without getting external data points. So I'm hoping you all will embrace this and be disciples about the power of this and how important it is to your business strategy. Oh, by the way, I wanted to mention, I apologize. I want this to be really informal. I really like the interactive. I want you to interrupt me with questions. You can put them in the chat because Marcia and Kate are going to be spotters for me.
We'll be watching.
Yeah, they will be watching. Or I don't care if you just shout out and say, hey, Rich, I have a question. I know what I want to cover. I don't care how we cover it. It can be rather informal. So as a gut check in terms of client feedback, so remember whatever Stephen Covey's habit was, begin with the end in mind. So here's some really key questions that you want to ask yourself as an organization. So what are you trying to accomplish specifically? That's going to inform the questions that you ask. So are you trying to address project delivery issues? Are you trying to really understand who are our key competitors and why are they our competitors? Are we trying to understand, what do they think of our firm? What is their knowledge of our firm? What do they think of our firm? So you have to understand what you're trying to accomplish, because obviously the questions that you ask are going to elicit data that's going to accomplish that. What does success look like? Are we thinking about current clients, past clients, prospective clients? The whole issue of who do we gather feedback from is really important. There's a lot of different ways to think about that. Do we, for example, do we lean into our client sectors where we have the strongest marketplace position and we're the most profitable, and do more interviews in that sector? Or conversely, do we say, wait a minute, we have these other client sectors that we feel are quote unquote like underperforming, where we could be doing more. For some reason, our marketplace position is weak. So maybe we want to focus on those and try and tease out data that would help inform market positioning, business development, PR, or help us develop a more thoughtful business plan. So there's a lot of different kind of analytical things that you need to figure out. Do you have the bandwidth to really hear the feedback and address it and make the necessary course corrections? Because if there's one thing that pisses off clients, it's when you ask them for their time and for their feedback, and then nothing changes. So that has been a real gut check for a lot of firms who have been so busy over the years. So that's really important. As I mentioned, that the next bullet, I've kind of already mentioned what your focus is going to be and who's going to ask the questions and how. Are you going to have an internal marketing or BD person that is outside the project chain of command asking the questions? Are you going to have someone on a project like a PIC asking the questions? Or are you going to engage the help of an independent third party? So that's also an important question to ask yourself. So, and remember, interrupt me with any questions as I go on.
I'll interrupt.
Yeah, please.
Rich, I recently started working with a partner firm out of state on debrief for a pursuit that we had gone after together. And my firm am of the opinion that you get better, more frank feedback if I ask questions of a potential client, or if an outside party asks questions. And they really believed that sending their principals in to ask the questions, in this case, in a feedback, but I mean, in a debrief, but think of it in other contexts, sending the principals in was an opportunity for BD because it gave principals more face time with that client. Do you have a feeling one way or the other about who to send in to get at these questions?
I'm not averse to doing that, as long as that person is trained to do this. And I think even more important than knowing how to ask really good probing questions and listening, which is not a given, by the way. I mean, one of the hardest parts, though, is can they detach themselves emotionally? Like, this requires maturity, because when you poured your heart into a pursuit, it naturally feels like crap if you lose. And sometimes you have feelings of resentment, whatever. And you have to suspend all that and be able to ask the really difficult probing follow-ups. So, Kate, that's what would concern me is, can the principal ask a question to elicit negative feedback and then have the emotional wherewithal and maturity to ask a follow-up question that may be equally painful? And I don't think
Right.
I don't think all of your principals can do that. And it's possible that not even all of your marketing folks can do that. So a good question. Did that's what I got for you, Kate. Any follow-up?
That's great.
Okay.
Nope, that's good for me. Thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Let me know. So, Kate alluded to one of the tools in terms of gathering feedback, of course, win and loss debriefs. And I've done complete separate workshops on just doing win and loss debriefs. So you all know about loss debriefs. It's like the bane of our existence, and they're painful and they're difficult. I tend to train a lot about win debriefs, which, if you're not familiar what that is, it is what it sounds like. It's, if you win, you would be remiss if you didn't seize that opportunity. The client selected you, the client wants you to succeed. So they are more than likely not going to blow you off. And you actually have more leeway to ask important questions about how you could do better, your shortlist, your proposal, whatever it is. And most importantly, what lingering questions or concerns do they have going into the projects, those types of things. So in addition to those, there's two other kind of main genres. One is what I would call a client prospect study. You may have heard of a client perception study or a client prospect perception study. And those tend to ask more strategic, big picture questions about what do you know about us? What's your perception of us? What can we do better? How are your needs changing? How's that going to impact what you want from an architecture and AE firm, et cetera? And then there's also a category, what I call ongoing client monitoring, which is a different flavor. And I do that with a couple of firms where at the end of a key project, and by the way, this is not for every project. You could never do this for every project. For very strategic clients, for very large projects, for very complicated projects, for projects where we're not sure where we really ended up in terms of satisfaction, I or someone in the firm will ask a lot of questions that are focused more on project delivery and how we did. So again, all these different scenarios, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So these are kind of the basic 4 tools that I'm gonna be referencing. In terms of value and applications, and again, I'm so keyed in on this because I have to always explain the value of doing this to clients and prospective clients that are, they're considering doing this. So from a strategic macro standpoint, one of the most important points is this helps inform your business planning and your strategic planning processes. So, you never want to go in blind, and it's not just external data. In terms of strategic planning, you would also want to gather internal data at some sort of cadence in terms of an employee survey, or maybe more informally, like 3 to 5 questions that everyone's going to ask during the review process. So in terms of strategic plan and business plan, you're going to be able to gather data that is going to inform how you're positioned and what you need to do to get more work. I mean, ultimately, that's the objective of a business plan, focusing on a specific client sector. So things you can tease out, trends and drivers that are impacting your clients. And then, of course, there's follow-up questions. As I said, how are these going to impact your wants and needs, or your own specific role? What's the competitive landscape? You can tease that out. This can inform new service offerings to bring in-house. What are additional unmet needs that your clients have? And then messaging. And by the way, this is messaging not just for market positioning, but also for business development messaging in terms of value and in terms of differentiators. So, and I'm going to walk right now, this is rather conceptual for you, but I'm actually going to give you some meat later on. I'm going to take some key themes and I'm going to give you some sample questions that you can ask. So, I want you to have lovely parting gifts from this workshop, things that you can bring back to your own firm. So,
Rich, I see a question in the chat. It's from Andrea Baker. How do you counteract tendencies to get defensive when the firm members get negative feedback or when a weakness is exposed?
How do you counteract that? So Andrea, hi Andrea. So I like to give my client perception 101 speech, which is, you may not agree with someone's perception, but it just doesn't matter because they're entitled to have that perception. Their perception is informed by data, by whatever they're observing. So that is why all you can do is listen and acknowledge their perception, and then ask clarifying questions to tease it out, and then to try and educate them. But if someone says, someone says to you, Andrea, so, oh yeah, no, your firm, you're really expensive, you're not going to say, no, we're not. You're going to say, tell me more. Like, is this based on your own experience, or is this something that you heard? And then it gets into broader discussions. So the very first firm that I was really brought in to do this wholesale was Haley and Aldrich back in 2009. And I participated in a meeting with all of the market sector leaders. And back then there were a number that were like, I don't want to, in this case, this was a third party. I don't want a third party talking to my clients. That's scary. So I know, and that of course went away once they saw the data coming back and the value. So it's a hard thing, Andrea, as is very hard to not game the system. So this is really tricky, because your principals or PMs or whoever that you would go to sort of find, who should we be gathering data from, they often feel like they want to game the system to give you the names of clients that they know are going to give positive feedback. But from an ROI standpoint, I hope you all realize that that's not where the value is. We're not doing this, especially if you're going to engage a third party, we're not doing this to get a pat on the back. We want to get true data that we can act on. So I don't know, Andrea, that's the best I could do, is to acknowledge what you just brought up and to try and educate them about it. A lot of people that are resistant to this are inherently insecure about what's going to be uncovered. So it gets to more specific, broader conversations about what's the fiduciary responsibility of a principal, for example. It's to the firm, but that's where you intersect human behavior and emotions. All right, let me keep going. We talked about that. So the next kind of, let's say a module, it could be informing project management, delivery, and staffing. So you can tease out the following: the quality of our deliverables, the timeliness of them, responsiveness and communication. How are we doing with respect to that? And you all on this call, you're smart. Most of you, you're either principals or you're marketers or business developers. You know that every client has a different communication style. They all have different hot buttons. You can tease out the efficacy of the project team. And I mean the broader project team. I'm talking about your teaming partners as well. Client leadership transition planning. So this is huge. So think about that. Client leadership transition planning. So one of the biggest fears that, because I've done thousands of these interviews over the years, is clients get nervous when they love their PM and they see their PM aging and they don't see the people behind the curtain doing the work, and they don't know what's going to happen when this person retires. So this often comes up in the interviews that I do, and it helps inform proactive client transitions, where you just determine who's going to be the person, and you introduce them and they accompany a current PIC or a PM. So, why is this important? Because we all like to brag about our 85 to 90% repeat work rate, as if it's a differentiator when it's in fact industry average. Well, there's a reason why we have that. And part of it is this continuity. You can even tease out information about contracts and invoicing, which is really important. You want to know, like, if your client needs more detail on an invoice because they're not able to sort of make the connection to the value that you're conferring, that's huge, important feedback. So I'm going to pause, Kate and Marcia, for 1 second. just to see if anyone had any questions about this slide. Anyone in chat or anyone else? All right, I will keep going. Informing business development and marketing strategy. So that's where, you can tease out differentiators, find out information about either new services. Do they know about new services that you've added recently? Or are there unmet needs that would yield new services that you want to think about providing? This is all about, finding out about their needs. What are their needs? What's being met? What's not being met? How are these needs changing over the years? Additional buyers and influencers to target. So, as people that have been through my training workshops know that I lean into asking probing questions a ton. So for example, even at the end of a project, when you're touching base with a client and you say something like this, like, Macy, I've really enjoyed working with you on this project. We would love to do more work. Who else would you recommend that we meet with? What advice do you have for us? So that's even a form of client feedback. It's not like an official client perception survey, but I often think about if we could train and sort of arm, so to speak, our PMs to ask these questions, and then if we could somehow institutionalize this knowledge through the project team or through a CRM or some other mechanism, even sharing like a project post-mortem that was successful or unsuccessful. If we could do a better job of that, we would be so successful, more successful. And one other important point, and this is something that if you are trying to educate your folks in your firm about this, a lot of people mistakenly think that we're doing this study or gathering this feedback because we want to identify leads, and it's all about business development. This is partially true, but you can't lead with that. Clients do not like it when they feel like you're asking them questions, mainly just trying to be an ambulance chaser fishing for work. So having more leads, identifying more influencers and decision makers, growing a client account, this is all gravy. But this is not the main intent. Why is this important? Because if there are people in your firm that are gonna be charged with asking questions, you can't start off by asking them, so, what other projects do you have coming down the pipe? That's gonna shut them down. Instead, you want to start off with questions that disarm them and focus on them, such as, tell me about your role. What's the biggest challenge? What are you trying to accomplish in the next 2 years? Those types of questions. All right, I'll keep going, interrupt me. Also, another area of value is informing recruitment and retention strategies. So folks, think about this. Think about how broad this value is. I've talked about kind of strategically about your firm. I've talked about project delivery. I've talked about messaging in terms of marketing and business development. And now we're almost covering the full gamut. We're talking about recruitment and retention. What are some weak spots that you need to fill? You will find that out when you gather data from your clients. Who are some of the superstars? We need to know this in your firm for acknowledgement and recognition and bonuses. And also, so we know who is really working well with a client, because we know the chemistry is a big part of that. Also identifying emerging leaders who could be viewed as potentially, future PMs or PICs for this particular client. So this is also really important, especially given the struggles for recruiting key talent that have happened over the last several years. All right, I'm just going to pause. Any questions from anyone? Questions or comments? All right, you're being a little too quiet for me.
Nothing in the chat yet, Rich.
Okay. All right, well, I will keep going. So now I'm going to dive into it. So I've tried to build the case. The value. Why should you do this? What's the value? Now I'm going to kind of go deeper into the process. So logically, of course, you have to, one of the most important things is figuring out who you're going to interview. And here are some of the considerations. A few of these I've already referenced. So, it all depends on what tool you're going to use. Is this going to be informal, where you're training your PMs or PICs at different junctures in the project to ask questions? Or are you going to have someone from marketing and BD at the end of a project? Or are you actually going to engage a consultant because you actually want to gather a significant amount of arm's length data as feedback into a business planning or strategic planning process? How many people are we going to talk to? Time is a constraint. If you're working with an outside party, resources are a constraint. So something to tell you, statistical significance is not a realistic goal. So for those of you that have taken stats, N is the sample size. So in my opinion, because we're not dealing with cures for cancer, for example, we're dealing with how clients feel and think about your firm and what's going on with them. I don't care, if it's not statistically significant. Are you really going to tell me if I speak to 5 clients, oh, Rich, I'm sorry, we can't really count that data because it's not statistically significant sample size? In my opinion, every single client matters. So I think you can agree with that. So I hope you understand it. Folks on this call, you're primarily from architecture and AE firms, I think. You don't encounter this as much as if you were working for an engineering and environmental firm. In my experience, engineers tend to get more tied up in the whole statistical significance piece, so which kind of makes sense. Are all of your client sectors created equal? Remember what I said at the beginning, they're not equal in terms of profitability. They're not equal in terms of marketplace position. But, going forward, are certain client sectors going to have disproportionate importance? Let's say, for example, if you're worried that a recession is coming and you're wanting to diversify your portfolio even more, maybe you want to lean into client sectors where you think there's greater opportunity. Are all geographies created equal? There's so much to really think about this that would help inform who's going to be on your interviewee list. The business, I'm going to tell you in the next slide, some more concrete business rationale for how do you choose who to interview. In general, you want to aim for the most senior person. Now you're going to say to me, Rich, wait a minute. If we aim for the most senior person, they're not going to be able to answer some of the questions because they don't really have as much day-to-day contact as the facilities person, let's say. So you have to use good judgment, but in general, you want the most senior person. And what happens is, in a worst case scenario, at times that person will say, something, I really think you should interview so-and-so because they have more day-to-day data points in terms of how the firm is doing. But it depends on the questions that you're asking. If you're not really focusing on project delivery, then by all means, you want the senior person, you want them to sort of share what they know about your firm, their thoughts about your firm, et cetera. So, and then also keep in mind that you may want to have more than one prospective interviewee from a client organization, especially if it's a large organization, if it's complex. I mean, folks, I don't have to tell you this, like firms out there that do higher education work. I mean, you may have a facilities person, you may have a VP of student life. So all of these people have different perspectives, and you may want to gather that. So here's some of the additional criteria for determining who to interview. Some of these I've already mentioned and talked about, so let me see what I haven't spoken about. I think the third bullet, market drivers that are fueling growth opportunities for your firm. for that particular client sector or that particular client. So what do I mean by market drivers? A lot of you are marketers. So it's, in other words, it's trends, it's legislative, economic, demographic, regulatory trends. Those are examples of market drivers that can impact your client's needs. The revenue from that client or from that market sector, is the revenue from the client so small that frankly you would rather use that interview to interview a larger client? And then I've already mentioned about diversification in terms of what's happening in the economy. All right, I'm going to pause because I see Kate Murphy. The chat went from 3 to 5. Did anyone have any questions or comments or no?
There was a question, you tell me, Rich, if you think we should hang on to this for the end, but the question was about whether you will cover how to sell the necessity of starting a feedback process to internal firm leaders.
No, I'll cover it. That's so important. And I hope that in part I've covered that, because the first thing you need to do is understand the value. Mm-hmm. So you have to understand the value to the firm. God, that's such a hard question to answer at some levels for me, because for me, and I'm biased, it's just so obvious to me why you would want to talk to your clients to sort of find out how you're doing or what they think about you. Something, I'm going to do something weird. I want to toss it out to the group. I actually want to ask the group this. Have you been in a position where you've had to sell this to reluctant people, and how have you done it? I mean, I can tell you, like, as a consultant from an ivory tower, how I've done this and all that, but on the front lines, have any of you had to do this? Please chime in. Kristen, your head was nodding.
Yeah, I was the one that asked the question.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Anyone have any thoughts?
I'll jump in.
Okay. Hi, Kate.
Hi. I know at my firm, some of the obstacles are the leadership says they already know how we're doing on a project, and they'll know if there's a problem.
Okay.
And then in terms of who's going to ask the questions, if it's someone in business development, they feel like they don't have the control to then make any negative feedback or to react on any negative feedback, because they're not the ones actually working on the project. So,
oh, that's good stuff.
After many, many, many years of what we all feel is obvious that we need to be talking to our clients, we finally started a fairly consistent feedback program, but it really we had to get buy-in from the people doing the projects that they were going to make changes if we got negative feedback. And only after that did people then feel comfortable actually going and getting the feedback.
Katie, so, I'm sorry, yeah. Go ahead. Were you going to say something else?
I don't know how. I think it was just after so many years of saying, we need to be doing this, we need to be doing this, we need to be doing this, that finally, you got to tell people 7 times, right? Like maybe 100 times. But I'm not really sure what finally convinced the company to start doing it, but it was a very long process to get that buy-in.
Okay, so Katie, thank you, because now you've unleashed all these these ideas in my brain that I want to share. So I had to take some notes. All right, so first thing, we already know what they're going to say. How dangerous is that? How presumptuous, if not arrogant? Now look, I'm not going to blow smoke. I'm not, when you do this kind of research, especially the kinds of studies I do, I can tell you that probably 80% of what the findings are you're going to say, we knew that. So I'm not going to try and, pull the wool over your eyes. It is normal, it is natural. And I would argue to say that if you did not know 80% of it, you're completely screwed. Okay, so part of this is an affirmation to get external data points. I'm telling you that the ROI in that 20% is huge. And I also think the affirmation to continue best practices is really good, right? So the next point, who is going to ask the question? And this whole thing about, well, if we have an internal person do it, a marketing BD person, they're not going to be the one to rectify it. So that's not good. That's hogwash, okay? Because the best firms that have done this, interviews are conducted, they analyze the results, and then the PIC or the PM comes up with what's known as a response plan, which is, what are we going to do with the data? Now, if it's a client that loves you to death and is singing your praises, the response plan may be brief. It may be thank them, acknowledge them and thank them, feed this back to the project team and keep doing this. Although it's very rare for me to do an interview where there's not something that someone can improve upon, right? I want to tell you something that this is such an important point, and I'm going to give Haley and Aldrich a bunch of kudos here, because when we started this, and this was driven by Larry Smith, their former CEO, his mantra was, we treat problems as gold. So think about that. We treat problems as gold, which sends the statement that when we gather this feedback, it is not going to be used in a punitive way. It's going to be used for continuous improvement. And it's no surprise that organization does lean consulting and applies lean principles internally, not just externally as a consulting service. So when you think about the resistance, if you could have a message from the top down that we're not doing this for punitive reasons, because we want to do better and we treat problems as gold, wouldn't we want to know about problems in advance so that we can affect change before a client says bye-bye and goes to another firm? So anyway, those are a couple thoughts that come to mind. But you see, so Kristen, and I think you've experienced this through your anecdote, you see how much is riding at the C-suite. Like, this has to come from the C-suite, because I don't think that efforts like this that emanate from the marketing and BD group are as effective as if it's pushed down from the C-suite. Okay.
Yep.
Any follow-up questions on what I just said?
No, this is super helpful. I'm brand new to AeroStreet, and we're gonna be
you're
learning.
AeroStreet.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I just joined about 4 months ago, so we're having planning conversations now, and I this is very helpful, so I can lay it out in a really clear way. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Any follow-up questions on what I just said? Anything at all? All right. I'm so glad you asked that, because that was a huge topic we needed to cover. Kate, was there anything else in the chat that I need to know about?
A lot of back and forth between me and Kristen about when to ask that question. So we're good. I think you're good.
Okay. So let's talk about the interview guide. I want to share like some tips and tricks and all this kind of stuff. Now, understand, folks, this is coming from my world where, I'm asked to interview 50 of your top clients. So you have to understand, like, this is like my process. So you don't need to follow this. I'm just sharing what I do, because I thought you may find it interesting and illustrative. The interviews, in my opinion, like if you're going to do a phone interview, I design them for 20 to 25 minutes in terms of how many questions are on the interview guide. However, I know full well that they're going to schedule me in a 30-minute block. So my goal is to have them for all 30 minutes and frankly beyond. So if they have to go at the end of 30 minutes, I will have gone through my questions. But if they want to keep talking, I keep asking questions. I've had clients that, I'm sorry, my clients' clients, I've had them, they've kept me on the phone for an hour. And that's awesome. It's, you know, it's incredible. I don't do these blinded. So what do I mean by that? So sometimes clients will say to me, you know, so Rich, who's going to see this? And then I have to explain, or they're going to say, are my answers going to be just thrown in with a whole bunch of other answers? And for me, you know, I say no, they're going to know that you said this. Now, why does someone ask me that question? I don't always know. Half the time they're curious, the other half, they are about to provide some negative feedback. And they want to know, A, am I going to get someone in trouble? B, am I going to, you know, look, you know, you all can improve, but bottom line, I really love working with you. I don't want to damage our relationship and all that. So I have to convince them of, you know, number one, like the culture of the company, this is not being used in a punitive way. Number two, they can probably, even if I were to not put your name by your comments, they can figure out who said what. So practically speaking, it's kind of an unrealistic ask. If someone were to really persevere, as happened once in 2022, only once out of hundreds of interviews that I've done, I granted that person the confidentiality. And, you know, because it was a matter of if they're not going to participate, then I will grant them that. But most of the time, they're worried that they're going to get someone in trouble. And all I need to do is to convince them that that's not what this is all about. And they're like, oh, okay. You know, and then they move on. The type and the ordering of questions is really important. I've already referenced this. What do I mean by that? It's that you want to save your self-serving questions towards the end because you want to disarm them at the beginning. They don't want to feel like this was a fishing expedition. Only, you know, in certain circumstances at the very end, I may say something like, you know, what I role played earlier with someone, which is, you know, hey, we would really like to do more work with you. What advice do you have for us? That's at the very end. It's sort of like, oh, by the way. So the way I take, in terms of figuring out, constructing the interview guide, I modularize it. So, you know, I think about these modules, which is going to mirror my earlier slides on the value that can be conferred from doing this. So module number one, maybe it's market and client intel. And here's a sample question. What are the biggest challenges and uncertainties your organization faces over the next few years? A follow-up question may be, oh, okay, well, given that, so what are you actually doing to address these challenges? Then a follow-up question might be, so, you know, how can we at ABC Architects, how can we help you with these challenges? So you see, these questions are a launching point for a bunch of follow-up questions that would gather feedback on market and client intel. Another bucket, their knowledge and perception of your firm. I mean, you're all marketers and business developers. Think about the power of that. So, you know, I like to do the word association. And then I can depict this in a word cloud. What words or impressions come to mind when you think of firm ABC? And I say it's like a word association. What services and solutions come to mind when you think of ABC Associates? So those are some examples of that. So here's another module on competitor intel. And I give you some sample questions. You know, you all can just use these questions. You'll notice they're all open-ended. What companies do you view as the leading providers of such and such services in your region or market? What is it about these companies that make them leaders? So if they list 3 or 4 firms, if time allows, I want to find out for each one of those firms, what is it about them? What makes them a leader? So it's really fascinating to hear this kind of information, and if you hear back things like, if their responses are all focused on fee, then that's a big tell as well. Another module, project delivery and client satisfaction. Oh my God, I could do 10 or 12 separate questions just on that. So what I tend to do, if I'm going to focus just on project delivery and client satisfaction, I'm going to want to address the quality of deliverables and timeliness of deliverables and QA, QC, and our invoicing and our contracts and this and that, our responsiveness and communications. So a general question can be, in what areas or services can ABC Associates improve upon and how? So you can do a couple things. You can ask a general question and wait for them to bring up timeliness. Like, Rich, one thing that drives me nuts is they will reach out to me a day before or the day something is due, and they'll say, sorry, it's going to be delayed. I can't stand that, Rich. They need to tell me much more in advance so they can fill in what are their hot buttons, or something about communications. I wish they would call me more. They only send me emails, whatever that is. So you can take that approach, or you can drill down and ask 6 or 7 specific questions and zero in on specific areas. So there's a couple ways to attack that. Advice for your firm. I love asking this question at the end. If you could offer any advice to ABC Associates, whether it's to its leadership or management or staff, what advice would you give them? They may say, keep up the good work. Oftentimes they throw in these nuggets. And the nuggets are amazing. I'll never forget, I interviewed someone a couple years ago in Florida, and this was a government client. And, the interview was very sort of gracious and not too heavy. And then at the end, the person said, I can't stand it when they're only in touch with me when they know that an RFP is coming out. It drives me nuts. Like, I need them to be in touch with me all throughout. So, as marketers and business developers, you could sort of preach that to your internal clients all day and night. But somehow when a client says it or when a consultant says it, it's suddenly like, it's the gospel. So sometimes you really do need to hear it from clients. So I want to pause for 1 second. Kate, Marcia, anyone, any questions from folks? Anything? You're good?
I was just shouting amen quietly to myself, but I haven't seen any other questions.
Okay. So just to let you know, I often develop multiple versions of an interview guide. If you look at a Venn diagram, there may be some common questions throughout all of the interview guides, but think about it. I'm not going to ask the same questions of a prospective client than I am of a past or a current client. There may be a few, and I've done very niche studies where, architecture firms have hired me only to talk to OPMs in the biopharma sector, or only to talk to sub-consultants. So, you're going to ask a different set of questions depending on who you're speaking to. So don't forget that. That should make pretty good sense. This is a fun slide because I thought about, and I'm actually developing a whole separate talk on this, but I was thinking, like, wouldn't people want to know, like, out of all the thousands of interviews I've done over the years, like, what do I hear the most? Or what are some doozies? When I was at Zweig White, Duke Energy, of all organizations, had an internal consulting arm Well, it was a consulting arm called Duke Engineering and Services. They were engineering and environmental consulting. And I interviewed some sort of utility in Vermont. And the guy screamed at me for an hour and a half. And I'm like, this is awesome, giddy up. This is amazing. Like, this is what I want. Like, they let it out. And, you know, I had to send all of the interview results to the client. For me, that's good. And, you know, it sort of feeds that inner need for me. That's the same reason why I chase tornadoes. You know, I want to have one big juicy client interview, you know, once a year. So here are some of the themes that I hear the most. If you have multiple offices, clients want a similar uniform client experience across offices. I just did a large study, not for an architecture AE firm, but for a civil and environmental, more of a land development firm. And you had entities from like a Pulte, all of the big home builders. I'm drawing a blank, a DR Horton, Pulte, et cetera. And some of them were telling me that people in various offices were having different experiences based on the team. So I hear that actually quite a bit. We talked about the second bullet already. I talked about the third bullet. I already gave you that example with the interview I did in Florida. Clients don't like ambulance chasers. We talked about clients don't like surprises. And this is something I just don't fundamentally get. You know, most people on your projects, they know before the day something's due if something is in jeopardy of being late. So I don't quite understand why that's so difficult to let people know. We talked about client leadership transition planning. That comes a lot. Documentation on invoices. You know, most of you don't do T&M work. I realize that, time and materials work. That's especially important for that. So now I'm going to read a couple. This is what I call actual film footage. I have a whole couple pages of quotes, like my favorite marquee quotes over the years. So these are just a couple of them. One and I'm going to read this because I feel it's so important. From a VP of facilities for a small private university. I don't go out to 20 firms. If I've gone out to 3 firms and you're one of them, you don't need to sell me or you wouldn't be there. For example, instead of spending 30 minutes selling and 15 minutes for content, the selling should be, you know, more in the 5 minute range. Beyond that, anything you show me as qual should be relevant to my project. From a managing director of a real estate development company, they need to consider the preferred method of communication that their target clients desire and adjust to that. So, by the way, this is a great case study on, you know, if you're going to have people in your firm ask these questions, are they going to know to ask a follow-up question like, please elaborate, please be more specific? So I did that. So some clients prefer face-to-face, others phone calls, others email. They could better adjust to that. I prefer face-to-face followed by phone calls. And at the bottom are emails and texts. So making those adjustments to me would make me feel better. In contrast, my colleague Tom is completely comfortable with email. So this bridges the gap to PM training, because in PM training, one of the things that I try and teach is at the beginning of a project, ask a question. So Marcia, we're so excited to work with you. Before we dive in, I want to ask you a question. Talk to me more about your preferred communication styles. How do you want us to communicate with you? Do your PMs ask that? Do they know that? For me, it's like a tacit contract with the client. You ask the question, they tell you, you adhere to their requests, and then throughout the project, you check in. And, Marcia, you told me, early on that this is what you wanted in terms of communications. How are we doing? What could we be doing better? So that's the BD circle of life. And that's how you feed that 85 to 90% repeat work engine that you have. A couple other quotes. Okay, this is the CEO of a 180-person structural engineering firm. The primary thing, oh, I think I asked about, what was areas for improvement. The primary thing would be regular and clear communications. When they have, and in my view, failed to meet a commitment or a milestone, I'd be more tolerant if I knew what was occurring behind the scenes versus just hoping and waiting for something to show up. They should proactively communicate with stakeholders. Often we don't hear, and then the due date comes and goes, and we're trying to track them down to get what we need. That doesn't happen on every project. I understand that things happen beyond their control, but proactively communicating, that would make us a happier client. And then this one, the VP of pre-construction for a developer. We're focused in Boston, but I travel back and forth from DC and work in this market, meaning the DC Mid-Atlantic market, and I manage pre-construction there as well. The other day when I spoke to person A, it was the first time anyone told me they had a DC office. From a BD standpoint, when you have a national developer with whom you have a great relationship, I've never had anyone call me and ask, how can we expand our relationship? We have 21 offices, and some of these intersect where they have offices. If it were me and my business model, I'd be all over it. And I know many folks from firm X know I travel to DC, and I find this rather curious. If firm X's CEO walked past me, I don't think I would know what he or anyone else on their leadership team looks like. This is a client that is literally like begging for more outreach. So, sometimes you have to hit people over the head, as you know, in terms of kind of ramping up BD. So I just want to do a time check. It's 9:18. So the last slide, I think this is, the last slide, and then I'm going to ask for more questions. This is kind of an interesting, different slide that I decided to throw in here, because I don't know if you all would even know this. If your firm does any mergers and acquisitions, so I've been engaged about 5 times to do a client study focusing on a firm that is about to be bought. So the purchasing firm might engage me or someone else to do a study of the clients of the firm they're trying to acquire. So it comes out like a normal client perception study from the firm that's going to be acquired. But why would you do this? If you're a firm that does acquisitions, this tests the goodwill in the marketplace. It tests how robust the relationships are. It tests how robust the backlog is, and it informs integration strategy. So we know in mergers and acquisitions, half of them fail because of cultural compatibility. And a lot of these live and die based on the integration plan once you acquire a firm. So this is another thing that I scratch my head and I'm like, I think every firm that that acquires another firm that's considering it, they ought to reach out to the firm's clients to find out how they're doing. I did this for a 200-person architecture firm in the Midwest that was acquiring a 40-person healthcare firm in the Rockies. And the data that I got back, believe it or not, it actually impacted the valuation, and it caused the valuation of the firm to drop because they had so many clients that were not happy with them. So as a gut check, you have to think, wait a minute, do we continue with the acquisition, or is this too much of a science project? Or if we do it, we need to do eyes wide open. So we need to figure out how we're going to rectify these issues. These are some of the, that's an interesting application of client research. I don't know if you would have thought of that. So that brings us to the end. And I want to ask anyone if you have any questions about anything that I've said, or do you want to push back on anything?
So Rich, I have a question because I conduct performance reviews for our company, and I want to talk about what happens when you can't get a client to talk to you. What happens when, like there's been several academic establishments that don't conduct performance reviews because they've had bad experiences and or they just don't want to. What do you do about that?
Are you, Marcia, to make sure I understand, are you saying your example, like an academic institution that will not permit, they won't be interviewed?
Correct.
Right.
Or it could be any client that just doesn't want to be, and they let you know, we prefer not to provide you with feedback, and you're kind of like, unbelievable, but
Yeah.
how do you deal with something like that, or not being able to get a client to participate in general?
Yeah, well, I mean, not surprisingly, the first thing I want to do is find out why. So I have to be very genteel about it. And I have to, so Kate, I hear you. I appreciate that. Help me understand a little bit more. Is this because of an internal policy or what? So I try and chip away to find out. Because Marcia, there have been instances where I've done studies where the interviewees are publicly traded companies. And I have to either go through corporate communications, or as a matter of policy, they won't do this. And in my experience, their biggest fear, this is in contrast to what I said earlier, where they don't want to upset someone or get someone in trouble. Their biggest fear is the inability to control the information that they provide. And their concern is that it is going to leak out, it's going to turn into a reference, or it's going to not turn into something that's not a reference or whatever. They don't want that floating out there. So, I have to find out why they don't want to do it first. And then I attempt to chip away. Like if they have a misunderstanding or misperception, I can do that. If they say to me, Rich, with all due respect, they interviewed me 5 years ago and I said the same thing and nothing's changed. That's a whole different conversation than if they're just fundamentally not into it. So yeah, I mean, it's like, it reminds me of the BD training that I do. We do a breakout exercise on brainstorming typical objections to hiring your firm. What do you hear? And then the first thing to do is, if you hear an objection, you don't respond. You have to tease it out and find out, why do they have this objection, before you open up your mouth and address it. So that's all I would have to say. That's a really good question. It's, just to give you some solace. I know when I do my studies and I do up to 3 rounds of outreach, if I don't hear from someone, I'm professionally tenacious. My hit rate is between 95 and 100%. So, a lot of it is the process too. How rigorous is the process, including, I didn't really talk about the outreach verbiage that is sent out via an email and a hard copy snail mail, believe it or not. Even in 2022, I recommend doing both. Any other questions from folks?
There are 2 in the chats. Yeah. One from Nicole Harrison at Erland. What's the best way to then take this feedback that you get and distribute it throughout your organization to improve on client services, or just acknowledge a team's great work?
Oh, that's good. That's a good question. So I have widely divergent strategies that my clients use. It ranges from, and this is probably not going to be a surprise, the organization whose mantra is "we treat problems as gold." They actually post all the interviews on their internal knowledge management system. All right. So that's on one end of the spectrum. on the other end is you would just report back to the project chain of command and also perhaps leadership. So, it all depends on the culture of the company and what you're trying to achieve. I've seen some of these turn into like lunch and learns, like positive case studies or negative postmortems, those types of things. So here's another thing, I just thought about this. I didn't even mention this. I sometimes get specific negative feedback about people. And as leaders, you need to really think about what you're going to do with that. So, for example, I'm not going to put up that interview for the whole company to see until I redact it, because there's nothing to be, There's nothing to be accomplished by having someone being humiliated, let's say. So it depends on the nature of the feedback, and it kind of depends on the culture. That's what I would say. I'm sorry, it's a squishy answer. I say it depends. What else? Was there one other?
Yes, let's see, Nicole had a question here. She said,
Oh,
what's-
that's the one I just asked.
oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Catherine. We often send online surveys to get feedback from our clients following project completion. Is there value in this alone? Do you have thoughts on pairing this with interviews?
I'm glad whoever asked that. I'm glad they asked that. So here's my Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, if that's the only thing you're going to do, it's better than nothing. However, I'm inherently biased against written survey tools because A, in my experience, the response rate is lower. B, people are reluctant to do short answer. So you get a bunch of yes, no, check off the box, blah, blah, blah. And then C, perhaps most compelling, you don't have that real-time opportunity to ask the probing follow-up. So if you're not going to do anything other than written surveys, go for it, God bless you. If you're open to more, I think phone or in-person interviews, formal or informal, are better than written. So that's kind of what I would say. Even the digitized tools out there that I mentioned, it's certainly better than nothing. My problem with some of them is that clients get asked for feedback too much. Like you have to control at what junctures you're going to go out to your clients if you're going to use a digitized tool. You can't keep going to the well, at 5 different times during the project. So yeah, I mean, that's what I would say. There's one other thing is, I suppose you could use a written survey tool, and if you get back something that would suggest, yikes, we need to have a more in-depth conversation with this client, then that's valuable. Then you can go in person, the PM and PIC or a marketing or BD person, you can then use the written survey to do an in-person follow-up to tease out more. So that's what I would say. What else? Anything else, folks? It's 9:30 already?
Yeah, it's 9:30.
All right, folks, if you have any questions, you can email me. I'm happy to even schedule a time. Also, go to my website and go to the Friedman file, which is my quarterly propaganda that I send out. And you can put in the word client research or client perception, and it'll pop up 3 or 4 articles that I've written, including some actual case studies that are pretty compelling. Anyway, I want to thank you all, and thanks again to Kate and Marcia. Have a great day, okay?
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining.